Hi, my name is Panio Gianopoulos. I'm the editorial director of Next Big Idea Club, and I'm excited to welcome you to our Q&A with Adam Grant, our esteemed curator and the author of the latest #1 New York Times bestseller. I'm going to hold it up here. Think Again. The jacket is so beautiful. Subtitle is The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know, which we're going to talk about in depth now for the next hour. Adam surely needs no introduction, but I still would love to list a few of his many accomplishments. Wharton's top-rated professor for 7 straight years, #1 New York Times bestselling author 5 times over, one of TED's most popular speakers. Excuse me, my voice broke with esteem. A renowned
I'm just going to have to leave for this part. I'll be back.
Yeah, just come back. I'm actually going to run out of fingers, so we'll end. He's been recognized as one of the world's 10 most influential management thinkers and Fortune's 40 under 40. Adam, also a former junior Olympic springboard diver. Do you have any siblings? Because it's got to be tough growing up with you around, just spotlight, middle of the spotlight.
You could do your next conversation with my sister Tracy, who's 6.5 years younger and is so much more creative than I am, that I basically grew up marveling at how anyone could have original ideas, because I am not a creative person.
Well, I find that hard to believe, but it would be really fun to do a conversation with you too, just getting the other side. Or like, are you a fan of Orson Scott Card? I feel like
of course, Ender's Game could be my favorite book of all time, but there are too many to list them all. But it's tied for favorite. How about that?
Right. Yeah, and then he wrote Ender's Shadow, which I always thought was such a brilliant idea to just do the whole thing. I would love it if we could get like, I always thought Harry Potter series, it'd be really fun to get it from Ron's point of view, or even Snape. Just like what really happened.
You know, didn't Stephanie Meyer do that with Twilight? Didn't she write the first book from Edward's perspective instead of Bella's? And no, of course I've never read Twilight or seen all the movies.
Yeah, just speculating. Well, so before we start answering member questions, and we do have a lot of questions, members have been excited about this for a while now. I want to talk a little bit about some of the core concepts of the book for those of our members or just watchers who aren't as familiar. And here's the book one more time, because I just do love this jacket.
And while you're doing that, let me just say a big shout out to the Next Big Idea Club members. It is so cool to have many of you here with us live. I love the fact that there are people who share our passion for new ideas and for being lifelong learners. And I think that being part of a book club is the single best thing that we can all do to invest in our ongoing learning and growth. So just delighted that so many of you are here with us. Now, Panio, back to you.
Thanks. Okay, so the core what is going on? I'm like a 14-year-old boy. Let me regulate my voice a little. The core proposition seems to be that, and I'm quoting you, that intelligence is traditionally viewed as the ability to think and learn, but what might matter more is the ability to rethink and unlearn. So what brings you to that conclusion?
Oh, I mean, in my life as an organizational psychologist, the answer would be Borders, BlackBerry, Blockbuster, Kodak, Sears, Toys R Us. I mean, the list goes on, right? We have all these companies that are run by very smart people who are good thinkers, but turn out to be not so good at the rethinking part, right? They fell in love with their vision or their strategy or their product or their service. And then, of course, they became obsolete. And I think this happens to us all the time in different walks of our lives. I can't tell you how many students I've taught, Panio, who come into my office hours saying, you know, I can't possibly abandon the idea of going to med school or law school, because I've known since I was 3 years old that I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I'm like, really? Like, how many decisions do you let your 3-year-old self make for you? You might want to be open to reconsidering that, because you now have a lot of knowledge about the world, about your own interests and skills, and your experiences have shaped your plans. So maybe rethinking who you want to be is something you could embrace too. And I just kept having these experiences where I saw people who were quick to form opinions, just being too slow to reform those opinions. And eventually I decided there are 2 things that can happen when I get frustrated by somebody who's doing something that I think does not track with logic and data. One is I just get annoyed by them and I try to avoid them as much as possible. And the other is I try to write the book that I wish they had read. And that's the path I went down with Think Again.
So are you finding that people are responding, that people responding and saying, I'm starting to open my mind more, or does it feel a little bit like preaching to the choir? I mean, that would be my concern, is people are so closed-minded that they wouldn't read a book about becoming open-minded.
Well, I think there always is that risk. And I think in this case, I've been pleasantly surprised. So a little backstory. When I did my first book, Give and Take, my hope was to try to motivate a lot of takers to become givers, or at least matchers, right? To say, if you're not going to be generous, you should at least be fair and trade favors evenly instead of being selfish. And most of the feedback I've gotten on Give and Take was from people who have said, thank you for validating generosity as a reasonable way to live your life, and helping me figure out how to set boundaries and be a smart giver instead of one who gets burned or burns out. And so I felt like I failed a little bit in the mission of maybe converting some takers. Here, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I have gotten probably the majority of reader feedback that I've gotten we're coming up on 2 months since the book came out, is from people saying, I've often seen changing my mind as a sign of weakness. And I'm now realizing that I've been too stubborn and I haven't been as willing to be flexible as I should be. And that means I've closed the door on learning a lot of things that didn't happen to match up with my beliefs. Or I've been willing to question some of my expertise that I developed in a world that kind of doesn't exist anymore because I live in a very turbulent field or industry. And I guess I got a preview of this when I was writing the book. I had a group of students who were my challenge network. These are in many cases, students who have caused me to rethink what I study and what I teach. And every time I've written a book, I've gathered a group of them together to read it and just trash it. And after rewriting the vast majority of the book based on their feedback chapter by chapter, one of the most interesting things that happened in our lab discussions was somebody would make a point and then somebody else would challenge it. And instead of getting defensive, the person on the receiving end of the challenge would say, "Ooh, this is an opportunity to think again." Or, "Oh, well, maybe I should rethink that." And they started prefacing some of the things that they would debate by saying, "All right, I have a completely different point of view, but I am entirely open to rethinking that." And I guess what I started to see was that rethinking can be liberating, right? Sometimes we have, whether it's identities or knowledge or opinions that we formed in the past that weigh us down and that prevent us from evolving and moving forward. And just getting the permission to do that, to say, "Hey, you know what, I've rethought that, or I'm willing to rethink this," seemed to be a joyful experience for a lot of people. So I'm encouraged, but you're a better judge than I am. You've been engaging with readers, you've been engaging with our club. What are you hearing? What should I rethink?
Okay, I don't know what you should rethink. I'm going to start right now. I do think that the joy of being wrong has resonated with a lot of people. Some of the questions we've gotten, I'll get to them later, are very much about how do you convince people who are wrapped up in ideas as part of their identity, right? So how do you separate identity from beliefs, or I don't know, ego, or whatever you want to put it. So that's something that I did see pop up a few times. And I know personally as a reader, I thought I love the book. I actually liked it so much that I ended up tearing the jacket in ecstasy as I was reading it. So you joined a small group of authors that I've done that with. It's the question of like, it gets a little scary, right? Because how much can you rethink? Can you rethink yourself into a new personality? And I love this idea that you had where, why would you base your life on a decision or a thought you had when you were 7 or 17 even, right? I'm in my 40s now, and I think if I were basing my life, like, why am I not a ninja? I mean, that's what I wanted to be when I was 14, is a ninja. And yet we hew to these beliefs that we had, or these dreams or ambitions we had when we were younger. So I think all of this really wraps into a lot of personal development as well as interpersonal kind of communications.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I've been rethinking since the book came out. Is I should have come up with a clearer hierarchy of what kinds of things we should rethink more often and less often. I would have said, okay, we should be very quick to rethink opinions and assumptions. We should be a little bit slower to rethink beliefs, and we should be probably the slowest to rethink our core values and principles. And I got stuck on that a little bit because I said, okay, yeah, you know what, it would be a problem if you were, just reinventing your values every day. But I also think that sometimes those are the most important moments of rethinking, right? Where you take a core principle that you've lived your life by, or a belief that was deep seated, and you start to say, I wonder if that was wrong or incomplete. And so in some ways, maybe I'm just justifying the decision not to have created the hierarchy. But part of me is relieved that I didn't try to do it, because I don't want to suggest that just because you shouldn't rethink something every day doesn't mean it's not important to rethink. And sometimes I think the things we should be slowest to rethink are actually where we have the greatest responsibility to do it. So I don't know what to do with that yet, but it's something I've been thinking and rethinking a lot about.
I love that hierarchy. I think that's really applicable and super helpful.
Well, then I'm going to rethink my rethinking of it.
Yeah, I think it's really good. I was going to ask more questions, but I'm going to start asking some member questions because it does tie into a lot of what we're already talking about. The first one is from Popsy Kanagaratnam. And if I mispronounce, I apologize. Trust me, people mispronounce my name all the time. I feel you, Popsy. How do we get people to recognize that admitting what one does not know is not the same as a lack of knowledge or qualifications, or as a complete lack of knowledge or qualifications?
Hey, Popsy, thanks for the question. I think we last saw each other in DC, if I remember correctly, and I'm so happy that you're here. I think we need a rebranding of "I don't know, I was wrong, and I've changed my mind." I think that too many people look at those statements and they say, "Well, you're ignorant, or you're incompetent, or you're a flip-flopper." And I think we need to recognize that those statements are a sign of actually being secure, not insecure, and a sign of being confident in your humility, right? To be able to acknowledge the things that you don't know, or that you might have screwed up or gotten wrong in the past. I think the easiest way to move in that direction is probably to get leaders to model this kind of behavior. I would love to see more leaders stand up and exemplify, saying, "I don't know, I was wrong, I screwed up, I changed my mind." And one of the examples that I keep thinking about is Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln came into the White House. He was convinced that if he abolished slavery, that it would permanently tear the Union apart. How lucky are we that he changed his mind? And I think if Lincoln were president today, he would have people trashing him on social media for being weak, for not sticking to his guns. And yet, I think if you look at the Lincoln case carefully, he was staying true to his values, but he was being flexible in his beliefs and opinions, right? He didn't really shift the value fundamentally. He wanted to abolish slavery from day one. And so in that way, he was very consistent in his principles, but he was open-minded in his policies. And I think that might be something that we need to spread, right? That we shouldn't expect people to be consistent in every part of their worldview. We should expect consistency when it comes to matters of integrity. But we should expect lots of nimbleness and willingness to adjust when it comes to questions that are really matters of science or evidence or fact, or just watching the world around us change and saying, maybe I don't want to be left behind. Maybe I need to update my thinking a little bit. So I would defer to anybody who doesn't just write books and talk for a living to figure out how to make that real. But I think leadership modeling seems to be a pretty key step.
That's great. I love that Lincoln anecdote too, because didn't Lincoln, I'm not a Lincoln historian by any means, but didn't he invite sort of ideological opponents to be on his cabinet? Wasn't that something he did? So he sort of created a challenge network.
Yeah, his team of rivals was his challenge network. And they were not only his ideological rivals, right? They were his literal rivals who he beat out for the presidency, which was, I thought, pretty neat. I think the thing that we don't talk as much about with Lincoln, because thanks to Doris Kearns Goodwin, the team of rivals gets a lot of press. What I think deserves even more attention is that in many days of his presidency, he held 4.5 hours of office hours where ordinary citizens would come in and he would just listen to their concerns. Now, can you imagine? I'm just going to go walk up to the White House door and knock and say, "I'm here for office hours." But I think it actually seemed to be pretty key to his rethinking, because it's one thing to make an abstract policy decision. It's another thing to have somebody who's unemployed, or somebody who is, who's really struggling because of one of the policies that you've made, come and share their experience with you. And I think today, occasionally we have presidents who have policies around reading letters. We have CEOs now who are starting to do virtual office hours with their employees. But I think we ought to go much further there. And people don't always have the right solution, but they are awfully clear on what the problems are.
Wow. You talk in the book, this isn't one of the questions, but it ties in, about how rethinking is a skill set, but it's also a mindset. And then you talk about the 4 different mindsets people use. Can you sort of break that down a little bit with a preacher, prosecutor, politician?
Credit to my colleague Phil Tutlock for writing a brilliant paper 2 decades ago on this that I have not been able to unthink once I saw it. What Phil observed is that we spend too much of our time thinking like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. When you're preaching, you believe you've already found the truth. You're trying to proselytize it. When you're prosecuting, you're trying to win an argument and prove your case. And when you're politicking, you are trying to win the approval of an audience through lobbying and campaigning. I worry that all three of these mindsets, when we do slip into them, they can stop us from thinking again. Because if you're preaching or prosecuting, you've already decided that you're right and somebody else is wrong. And that means you are not going to stop to think again. If you're politicking, you're motivated to tell that audience what you think they want to hear, but you're probably not adjusting your internal views deep down. My favorite alternative, which comes from the social science, is to think like a scientist. And let's be clear, when I say think like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to go out and invest in a microscope, a telescope, or a lab coat. Although I would enjoy it if people walked around in lab coats. I feel like a few more Bill Nyes in the world would not be the worst thing. But when I talk about thinking like a scientist, I just mean you value humility over pride and curiosity over closure. And I think the core principle of being a scientist is that you don't let your ideas become your identity. Right? You're motivated to look for reasons why you might be wrong, not just reasons why you must be right. You're excited to hear from people who challenge your thought process, not just the ones who agree with your conclusions. And you're eager to listen to ideas that make you think hard, not just the ones that make you feel good. And if we had a few more people who thought like scientists and also a few more scientists who thought like scientists, we might have a little bit more rethinking and a little bit more progress in a divided world.
That's great. I'm a big fan of the lab coat. It's also a handy last minute Halloween costume. Your stuff, vampire or lab coat or both. Scientific vampire. Here's a question from Elizabeth Whittington, and it's about imposter syndrome. So she said, "There's been a think again moment about imposter syndrome, especially as it relates to women. A recent HBR article asks if imposter syndrome could be the result of subtle systemic discrimination. How can we reconcile the benefits of imposter syndrome with this new idea?"
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think this is such an important question to be asking right now. And one of our former doctoral students, Basima Tufik, who's now in the MIT faculty, really made me rethink this. So I think those of you who've read chapter 2 of Think Again will know that Basima measured how often people have imposter thoughts. There's moments of doubt where you say, I wonder if I'm up to this challenge, or maybe I'm not qualified for this position. And she found that there were no consistent costs of having those thoughts more often for investment professionals and medical professionals. And there were surprising benefits that investment professionals made better decisions when they doubted themselves more often. And that medical professionals actually listened to their patients more and showed more care and respect and compassion. And I think there's a basic benefit of, just when you doubt yourself, that means you're not overconfident. You're not going to get complacent. You're motivated to prove yourself, and that may lead you to work harder. You're also aware that you're not the most knowledgeable person in the room. And that puts you in a beginner mindset. You work smarter, you learn more from the people around you. And so I think there are benefits there. I think where it becomes costly is when it becomes a syndrome, right? So I think the first thing we should recognize is the syndrome itself is really, really rare. To talk about it as a debilitating chronic disorder or condition where you walk around in life thinking you're a fraud and everyone is going to find out that you haven't earned any of your success, right? That's a problem. Empirically, it seems that women do tend to experience that more than men. And I would be shocked if that wasn't because of the basic stereotypes that we have societally, which are, from a gender perspective, that men tend to be assumed to be competent. And women have to prove their competence. Alice Eagley and many other psychologists and sociologists who spent their careers studying this dynamic, very well documented across a lot of different cultures. And I think that probably leads a lot of women to internalize those doubts when they have them. Right? To say, well, you know what, I'm not used to people expecting me to be an expert. And so maybe I'm not one, right? Whereas I can walk around as a white man and I say something and I cite my sources and people just kind of assume that I know what I'm talking about. That's grossly unfair. It needs to change. I think while we're working to change the social structures, we can teach people to harness it as a benefit. And I think the first thing is just to have some self-compassion, to recognize that everybody has imposter thoughts. And if you don't, then you are at risk of becoming arrogant and also ignorant. The second thing is to say that when you have those thoughts, you have a choice about how you react to them. You can treat them as gospel. You can take them as fact and say, well, this is true. I am definitely not qualified. I don't belong here. And that's probably going to crush your motivation. Or you can say, okay, let me try to, as long as I'm feeling this, let me try to use it as fuel. Let me say there is a gap between my confidence in myself and other people's confidence in me. And the best thing I can do in this situation is try to learn from the people around me and work hard so that my performance is better. And then my confidence will rise with it. And I think that those two things don't have to be treated as mutually exclusive, right? We can harness imposter syndrome as motivational fuel to learn and to work hard at the same time that we're trying to stop treating people as chronic imposters just because they happen to look like a certain demographic group.
That's fantastic. And to your first point, I think this is something I try to teach my kids is people do have doubts. They just don't necessarily express them. So whatever doubts you have, most likely other people have. So give yourself a little break.
Love that. I probably should have just said that. That was much more concise.
No, that was the explain it like I'm five version. Your version's better. So this is a question I also had. This is from Patricia Yoder-Wise. She said, what have you learned about extremist thinkers, think in a political sense, and how they can rethink?
Not as much as I would like is the short answer. I think if I were going to write a new chapter of Think Again today, it would probably be about something to do with conspiracy theories and people who seem to be believing things that are false. I think I've been reading a lot about it. I've been going through a lot of social science evidence, and I don't want to tell anyone that it's going to be easy to get people to rethink some of their deep-seated conspiracy theories. I do think, though, there are a couple of things that are interesting about conspiracy theorists as a group when you study them. The first thing is that they tend to often hold contradictory conspiracy theory beliefs. There's a paper that came out recently, and this is, Panio, we just have to pause on this for a second because the cleverness of this research just made my day. And then I was really depressed about the findings of it. But the question was, what do you think really happened to Princess Diana? And it turned out that the more strongly people believe she faked her own death, the more strongly they also believe that she was murdered. You're like, wait, those two conclusions cannot coexist, right? If she faked her own death, she's still alive. She couldn't have been murdered, and vice versa. And what you start to realize as you look at data points like this is that the part of the motivation to believe in conspiracy theories is you want to believe that events in the world are driven by human action, that they're under control, that they're not chaotic. And this is one of the most basic principles of the psychology of reasoning with unreasonable people. If you want to change what people believe, you have to know what they want to believe. So I would say there are a lot of people on political extremes who are very motivated to believe that things just don't happen due to bad luck or due to accidents of circumstance. And there might be an opportunity for getting them to rethink that belief by saying, okay, so let's go through a bunch of your conspiracy theories and just explain to me, like, how would that work? How is it, for example, that there are a lot of independent scientists with tenure right now who have no incentive to do anything but try to advance the truth. And in fact, if they can topple the establishment views, they're going to make a much bigger name for themselves in the field. Why have none of them published in reputable journals, some serious concerns about vaccine efficacy? And just, I'm not saying that there aren't any concerns, but just help me understand, why aren't any of these scientists doing this? I have tried to herd scientists. It's very difficult to get them to do anything unless they want to do it. And they believe in freedom of speech. And I can't even imagine coordinating them to do something as simple as eliminating grading curves, forced grading curves, which I've been trying to do at Penn for years. So this just seems like a really big challenge. And then, the government is now in cahoots with big pharma, but you told me the government was incompetent. So how are these people orchestrating such a big, a perfect conspiracy? I just want to know how they've pulled it off. And while we're at it, could you maybe, and obviously I wouldn't do it in such an animated way, but I am really fascinated.
Yeah.
I'd want to know a little bit about, how is it that there is not even one journalist who wants to win a Pulitzer Prize for blowing the lid off of this one? Mm-hmm. Right? Look at Watergate. Some conspiracies are real. I'm sure there's got to be somebody out there doing the reporting who wants to to be recognized and wants to get the truth out there. Like, where are those people? Anyway, so these are the kinds of conversations that I want to have. And it's not going to talk somebody out of a conspiracy theory or a belief in some false information. What I'm trying to do is to get them to explain things in such a way that they see gaps in their own knowledge. And once they realize that they don't fully understand how their own beliefs work, they're a little bit more open to reconsidering them.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I agree. The conspiracy theories are, I mean, they're all different kinds, from really extreme to sort of more innocuous ones. But even ones like, oh, we never landed on the moon, and ones like that, like, oh, flags don't wave. So they're, they'll have supposed evidence. And then, I don't know, I never really know how to engage with them, because it is very passionate in a way. It's almost like a hobby, and and it seems more like a refutation, to get to your point about paradoxes and embracing paradoxes, than an assertion. It's like, well, it can't be the way it is. Maybe it's this, or maybe it's that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Tim Harford just wrote a great piece, I think, in The Atlantic about this, about how the belief in conspiracy theories and false information is often about not believing something more than it is believing some alternative something. And I think there's some truth to that. And it's always ironic to me, because, like, wait, so you have very high standards of proof when it comes to accepted scientific knowledge. Where did those standards go when you were considering all these other theories, right? This is really strange. I think one of the best conversations I've had with people who are pretty cynical about a lot of things that, as a social scientist, I think are long past the point of real reasonable doubt, is to say, well, tell me what evidence would change your mind. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, people will start to map out the evidence that they would find compelling. And once they've bought into those standards of proof, it's a little bit easier to reason with them on the grounds that they think are convincing. In some cases, I've had people say, nothing could change my mind. And at that point, I'll just say, hey, I understand this is a religion for you. I prefer to live in the world of science, of hypotheses that I can falsify, and theories that I can test, but I'm not going to impose that on everyone with every belief they hold. And more of the time than not, they will backpedal in that situation and say, oh, actually, you know what? No, it's not that I would never change my mind. It's just that this is really unlikely, and the following things would need to be true. And all I want to do is plant the seed that they are willing, under some conditions, to reconsider. And I think that's the beginning of cultivating some openness.
I love that. Yeah, that question about, what evidence would help change your mind, I think it's really a powerful strategy. And you can even apply it to yourself. If you have a belief, I'll think, well, what would actually change my mind? In fact, in preparation for this conversation, I thought, what if Adam does a gotcha question? And he's like, when did you recently change your mind? And I thought, and I couldn't think of anything, which is really embarrassing. And then I went, oh, I'll go ask my wife. She'll tell me when I was wrong. So then I went and asked her. And actually, my daughter overheard me, and she said, oh, remember when Roman, our son, said that bananas were 50% human, and you said that's ridiculous? And then I looked it up, and apparently it was 50% same genetic material. But I conceded. I was like, okay, it was kind of awkwardly phrased, but you're right. So yeah, we were definitely, it's worth pointing that at ourselves too.
Panio, I can't believe you're so stupid that you didn't know that a banana was 50% human. I think you should be vilified for that until the end of time. But no, this is actually a great example of what we need more people to do. And it's actually something that I've started doing with our kids. My wife, Allison, is often making fun of me about this, but I still really like to be right. It's, sort of part of the reason that I became a social scientist is I wanted to have better data and, more convincing evidence-based arguments. And I frequently find myself struggling to admit when I'm wrong. And I don't want to be that person anymore. And I don't want our kids also to learn from that. And so one of the things we've started doing is we've started telling stories about times when we were embarrassingly wrong. And now our kids have picked it up, and they'll actually just point it out right away and say, actually, you know what? There's a more recent example of that. They thought it was hilarious that we grew up believing that Pluto was a planet. They're like, well, one of our daughters actually asked us, like, what century were you born in? Like, how old are you? And to be able to laugh at ourselves in those moments and say, you know what, at the time, you might not believe us, but a lot of people thought that was true. It's a great way to I think encourage them that, to be open to, I guess, just recognizing that the faster you admit you're wrong, the faster you can move toward being right.
Yeah. Poor Pluto, though. I have a real soft spot for Pluto.
Devastating.
It was a demotion. It was rough.
I'm still honestly a little bit upset about that. I'm like, well, how do we know that Neptune is going to keep its stance? And what if there's another planet out there that leads us to reinstate Pluto? Have I abandoned it too soon? I'm excited to find out.
Pluto's revenge. Okay, great question that ties into what we were talking about. Louisa Wright says, how does teaching in the classroom compare or prepare you to teach as a parent of your own kids?
Not well enough is the short answer, Louisa. Thanks for the question. I think probably the most helpful thing that the classroom did for me was it gave me a lot of practice having people who are a lot younger than me challenge me and be right and have me realize I was wrong. I have marveled year after year at how many times my students encourage me and inspire me to rethink what I teach, but also how I teach. And I think one of the more interesting moments that I had actually was a couple of years ago. I'm trying to think of exactly, I guess it was right after I wrote Originals. I had a student come up and say, your class is really not consistent with the book you just wrote. I'm pretty sure I wrote the book based on things that I do. I think I would know. Yeah. And, I asked some questions. I was like, well, tell me more. What are you really after here? And she said, well, you're teaching a whole class on evidence-based management. And that means we don't really get to rethink anything. We don't have our own original ideas, right? You're saying, here's what the best evidence teaches us. And, we're glad to know what that evidence is, but don't you want us to be creative and, and come up with new ideas? And I said, yeah. You're right. This is a failure, this class, when it comes to original thinking. Because once I tell you what the meta-analysis, the study of studies of randomized controlled experiments and longitudinal data points will tell us, it's pretty hard to poke holes in that. And I ended up adding a new assignment to the class, which has become one of the students' favorites and probably my favorite, where they do a mini TED Talk or a mini podcast episode where they advance an idea that challenges a principle we've covered in class, or that puts boundary conditions on it and says, hey, you know what? You might have learned that empowerment is, on average, a great way to motivate people. We're going to do a little story and find some data about when empowerment backfires. And the students have been wildly original in challenging a lot of the things that I took for granted and really getting me to think more broadly and deeply about what my beliefs are. So I think that was great preparation for parenting, because our kids do every day what my students do in this assignment.
That's fantastic. And kids do relish when their parents are wrong. Any sort of one of my favorite memories of my father, and he wasn't wrong, he was just clumsy. We were playing mini golf and it was a dinosaur themed park. And he tripped and he slid all the way down the back of this giant brontosaurus. And it was so ridiculous that he was screaming kind of like, sort of like a sort of Daffy Duck tantrum because he was so mad. And we laughed. I mean, he was mad at us for the entire trip because even my mom couldn't stop laughing. Like those moments when these figures of authority just kind of look ridiculous. I think it's important for kids to have that, where it gets a little punctured.
One of the saddest things about the pandemic, not in the actual consequences sense, but in the missed opportunities for kids to laugh at parents for being wrong. There's a saying in my family. It's called an Adam turn, originally named by my in-laws. I have no sense of direction whatsoever, and I've literally made a wrong turn within a couple miles of coming home multiple times with family members in the car. And so there's this ongoing tradition where it'll take 15 extra minutes to go somewhere because I made a wrong turn, even though I've been there before. And they call that an Adam turn. And our kids have not gotten to laugh at me nearly as often on that as they normally do. And I kind of miss it because it's a daily, guess what? I'm kind of an idiot. I am definitely extremely fallible. And I know there are sometimes people who listen to me and read my books and follow my advice. If they only knew about the Adam turn, they would realize they should question that.
That's really funny. Oh, there's my dog. Sorry about that. I'll mute it for a second. She's very excited. I shushed her like that ever smarts a dog. Okay.
No worries.
All right. Just ignore her. So Mary Hendra has a wonderful question about binary bias. So in her experience, it seems like some people are more comfortable living in the gray area of uncertainty than others. But what does research show? And are there strategies for helping ourselves or others live outside of binary?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on individual differences in whether you like to see the world in binary terms or whether you're more comfortable in the complexity and the shades of gray. Probably the two most robust literatures that I can think of are on what are called need for cognition and need for closure. So if anybody wants to do the dork task or the geek task, look up Cassiopo and Petty on need for cognition, and then Kruglansky and colleagues on need for closure. And what you see in general is that those tendencies tend to load pretty strongly with the big five personality trait known as openness to experience. Where more open-minded people tend to be more curious, they're excited to see all the different sides of a prism, and people who are a little bit more traditional and conservative in their thinking, and sometimes get labeled, I think sometimes unfairly, as closed-minded, are more likely to want closure and less likely to enjoy effortful thought, thinking hard. And I think that in terms of getting people to be more curious, more excited to tackle those hard problems and the complexities. The best thing I knew how to do was write this book, frankly, was to say, okay, I think there's something about engaging with a cohesive universe of ideas, right? That brings together studies and examples through a common framework and lens that I hope would shift people. I would love for somebody to run this experiment, and it can't be me because I know what I want the result to be, to see whether engaging with a book like this actually leads people to be more open to rethinking, or in this case, to seeing the complexity in the binary that they like to draw. I think that one of the specific techniques that I probably didn't write enough about in the book is something that a former student taught me about. His name is David Ryder. He's the only student I've ever seen do a joint master's in business and social work. And David used to be the national training director for an organization called Men Can Stop Rape. And his job was to engage with men who had relatively hostile attitudes toward women and try to get them to rethink those. And he had I thought, a really clever way to start the conversation, which is, he basically would ask them to think about times when they had been victims of stereotypes or prejudice. So he had them write down first all the ways that people misjudge them just based on their appearance, or just based on their background, or just based on the initial, first few words in an interview or a meeting. And what he would expose is people are constantly being treated unfairly and harshly when there's a binary judgment of someone who's seen as smart or dumb, or good or evil, or likable or nasty, right? And then he would slowly build the bridge and say, all right, so, you obviously are not a fan of people doing that to you. Let's talk about times when we've done that. And he would start by sharing his own mistakes, the times when he'd fallen into that trap. And that, that normalized the vulnerability. It made it a lot easier for people to say, oh, I can admit that I've made this mistake without being judged. And I thought it was a great example of the beginning of the kind of openness to complexity that we all want to see. And that probably is the best example that I have ever had a chance to witness indirectly through David's stories.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think a big part of that, right, is sharing your own vulnerabilities and your own sort of struggles with it.
Yeah, there's also, I saw a great TED Talk on this, I want to say last year, by Heather Lanier, which I will put in the chat. I think it's called something like Good and Bad or Incomplete Stories That We Tell Ourselves. And I thought it captured this very nicely.
Oh, great. We have a question from, let me think. I think this is from Ted Hill, or I'm giving this credit to somebody else. What are the three most important aspects of life that we should, quote, never stop evolving and never stop learning about? Seems like a very subjective question, but I don't know. Maybe let's hear your opinion.
Three aspects of life that we should never stop rethinking and evolving around. It's a really interesting question that I have not been asked before, and I want to actually think about it for a second. I'm trying to do a little bit less thinking fast and shallow and a little bit more thinking slow and deeper. I think one thing that we should never stop rethinking is our responsibility. I think, if you look at the events of last year with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of people suddenly started rethinking what their responsibility was around fighting systemic racism. And I think a lot of people, myself included, really focused on race there. And rightfully, a lot of other groups were, in some ways, I don't want to say upset, but concerned that there wasn't an opening of the aperture, that we had to have the same awakening on race that we did on gender. And do we have to do this for every single category of disadvantage that exists in the world? Disability, let's take that as an example. I think if you look at, I saw some data recently that if you look at Fortune 500 companies' diversity and inclusion statements and policies, only 7% of them even mention disability, let alone distinguish between mental and physical disabilities and visible and invisible disabilities, right? And there's a ton of stigma there. I think that's something we need to be thinking about how we can address and change. And so I think this idea of constantly rethinking, okay, what systems might be unfair in the world? What groups might be disadvantaged or marginalized or excluded? And what is my responsibility and my opportunity to try to do something about that? That's something we should always be open to revising. I think the second thing that I think we should always be rethinking is our identity. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I am stunned by how often people fall into this identity foreclosure trap and just get attached to this old sense of who they want to be. And I think that the part of the fun of identity is that you can do what Herminia Ibarra would call finding a provisional self or testing out a possible self and saying, all right, let me try that one on and see how it feels. And we can do that with careers. We can do that with hobbies. We can do that with our families, right? I think there's something to be said for identity experimentation and exploration. And then the last thing that I think that we should always be rethinking is just our routines and habits. One of the things that I think is saddest about the pandemic, again, in the everyday sense, not in the loss of life or threat or recession sense, is how long it took so many of us to question our basic habits. Like, okay, I tend to try to have a pretty empty inbox by the time I go to bed. What if I let that go? And instead I answered emails in the morning, and I found that shifting a little bit of the email work to the morning gave me momentum. And I felt like I was in a rhythm of responding and typing, and that made it easier to do some of my harder, more cerebral writing and thinking there. So, it's a small example, but I think a lot of us also didn't rethink routines about what do I want my commute to be? And even, where do I want my home base to be? And it seems like we should be continually questioning those kinds of things.
Wow, that's fantastic. Off the cuff, that was really impressive.
I'll give shorter answers next time.
No, I really liked it. It's a question from Jer Benavides. In your last episode of Taken for Granted, you discuss with Daniel Kahneman both the usefulness of being detached to ideas and being irrationally persistent. Would you attribute your success to being detached or being irrationally persistent?
Yes.
Good answer.
It's a combination of the two. I think that, like everyone else who takes pride in grit, there have been times in my life where I have convinced myself that my persistence was totally rational. And there have been other times when I've regretted not rethinking and then, sort of tried to teach myself to pull the plug sooner. This is actually going to be the first episode of Work Life this season, coming up in, I think, 2 weeks-ish. It's an episode about how to rethink bad decisions, and we take on this exact question, which I think we left hanging in the conversation I had with Danny Kahneman. I think that this is one of those situations where, again, my colleague Phil Tetlock captures it beautifully. He would say that the opposite of every great truth is another great truth. And so here, one truth is that persistence is probably one of the most important keys to accomplishing anything that matters. It's also true that knowing when to quit is one of the most important keys to accomplishing anything that matters. And I think knowing the difference between the two is often more art than science. And it's something that I've studied, that I've taught in my classes, that I've written about, and I still find myself uncertain about it in my own projects and choices. I think the one thing that has probably been helpful to me that we didn't take on in the episode, but which I've been thinking a lot about is recently I've done an analysis of the projects where I was sort of productively persistent versus counterproductively persistent. And I've tried to figure out what are the kinds of situations where I can trust my instinct to keep going, and what are the ones where maybe I fall into one of these escalation of commitment traps. And I think if you do that analysis, you'll learn things about your own habits and tendencies. One of my discoveries was I have a much harder time pulling the plug on something if it's only mine. If I'm in a team and other people are attached to it, I get really worried about serving the team well and making sure that I'm not letting them down or steering them in the wrong direction. And sometimes that makes me even too quick to rethink. But if it's just me, I will stay in that rabbit hole because I have nothing to lose.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that conflict between persistence and escalation of commitment, that dogs me. I worry as a writer myself. I spent 7 years on a novel, and I knew the entire time it wasn't working. Like that little voice in the back of my head was like, it's just not. And then I finished it, and then I wrote a novella in a month, and it was so much better, and that got published. And then the book I spent 7 years on, nothing happened to it. And I think, why couldn't I have just, because I'd put hours and hours and hundreds of pages. But there is, you do have to kind of listen to yourself a little and just do that tough thing of like, just put it in a drawer and put it away.
Wow. 7 years?
7 years. I mean, I wrote other things during the time. I wrote a lot of essays and stories, but that was, the big project that all my friends would ask me about, how's the novel? And then but I also think there's a specific problem to fiction writing, which maybe doesn't apply to nonfiction, which is that a lot of fiction, you're mining sort of personal questions and crises and things that you're trying to work through. And by the time 7 years goes by, you've changed enough that those questions are no longer interesting. You've sort of resolved them, hopefully. And so now it's time to write a new book. Same every 7 years, just it's time for a new book.
Wow. Oh, it's such an interesting example. So first of all, what came out of that? Was this, was A Familiar Beast after this?
That was the one that came out of it. Yeah.
And would you have written A Familiar Beast if you hadn't been in this 7-year slog?
That's a great question. I do think to some degree it was a reaction because it was a very short, quicker, more, I don't know, it was less cognitive and really more emotional. So you're right. I probably had to go through that. And to what somebody's comment, which I just saw pop up in the chat, absolutely, publishing and writing, they're not, just because you get something published doesn't mean a success. And just because you don't doesn't mean it's a failure. So that's absolutely true. But in this instance, I just knew as the creator of it, I was like, no, I missed the mark. I really did. I messed up.
Yeah, I guess there are two things I would wonder about there. The first one is, is it the actual idea, or is it the way that you've executed it, right? That you're escalating your commitment to. And I think sometimes the mistake we make is we say, all right, this isn't working. And then we abandon the whole project, as opposed to saying, no, there's an interesting question, right? If you're me there, or there's a really compelling character and plot line there, only it's actually one of the supporting characters, and you need to amplify it into the protagonist. This goes to the second thing I was thinking about. I had a fascinating conversation with Margaret Atwood when I was interviewing her for Work Life a couple of years ago. And I basically came away thinking that she would, I don't know if she would quite articulate it this way or not, but it seemed to be the case that she probably would not have written A Handmaid's Tale if she hadn't procrastinated on that book by doing other stuff. And it was she in her words, this is actually her words verbatim. She said she thought Handmaid's Tale was too batty and that nobody would read it. And so, she kept not working on it, and she had all these other ideas that she thought were more palatable, and she had to rule those out and find out that they were not going to work and they weren't living up to her creative taste and her standards before she was finally willing to give it a go. And I just wonder how many of us need to get the thing that's not working out of our system in order to try the thing that does.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also when you're talking about something creative, a lot of the times you might shy away from the baddie thing or the crazy thing, but that's the thing that's going to resonate with people because it is different and interesting and provocative. and you just have to muster the courage or the confidence to try that.
Agreed.
We have time for a few more questions. I have one about social media, which is, the advice has traditionally been, just ignore the trolls. If someone says something mean or obnoxious or stupid, you ignore it. But do you feel that there is an opportunity to engage in an intelligent way and turn people, or should you just not bother?
What do you mean by trolls?
Well, okay, so I guess not trolls, but if someone's, I don't know, on Facebook or wherever, and they're just rabidly disagreeing about something, and you'll see these people start to bicker, go back and forth, and at some point it just feels like it's a useless gesture of two people just digging in their heels. No one's going to convince either one of anything. Is it worth trying to sort of say, well, what evidence would convince you? Say you're one of the people who got sucked into this like ridiculous debate, or do you just, like Gil Perez says, unfriend them and move on?
I think it depends what your goals and values are.
Right.
So the first question I would ask is, do you enjoy having these kinds of internet debates? Some people do, right? Mm-hmm. One of my all-time favorite cartoons is the guy who can't sleep at night, and the speech bubble is, I can't sleep. Someone is wrong on the internet. I'm like, I can totally relate to that. If I had more free time, I wouldn't mind going back and forth with some people who I think are thoughtful, but disagree with me on a bunch of issues. But I've decided that I don't want to invest my time that way, because I'll end up in a rabbit hole of a conversation with one person on one thread. And I feel like since I have a platform, I have a responsibility to speak more broadly and try to use my time in a way that has more impact. But if you have the time and you have the interest and the inclination, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. I think you have to go in arguing to learn, not just arguing to win, right? So that each time you have one of these back and forths, you're not just focused on the content of the debate that you're in, you're focused on the process, and you're asking yourself, did I get better in this one? Did I try a new approach? Can I step out of the weeds of this particular issue and see that I'm approaching the forest the same way that I always do, and I'm prosecuting instead of trying to inquire like a scientist would? I think there's something there. And then the other question is, from a values standpoint, is it important to you in your life to try to talk people out of hateful or wrong beliefs? That's something that some people want to engage with and other people don't. I've become convinced that it's more doable than I would have expected, and I'm waiting actually for somebody to dig into this. But there was an incredible example a couple of years ago on Twitter where Sarah Silverman had a troll who was just saying things that I could not believe anyone would think in their head, let alone say out loud. And she just responded with, I think, unflappable kindness, saying, "It sounds like you're really hurting right now." And it turned out that the guy was in severe back pain, and he'd had a really hard time and become very cynical. And she essentially talked him out of it. And he turned over a new leaf. And I was like, whoa, okay. Like, it helps to be as smart and funny as Sarah Silverman. But like, if that could happen on Twitter, maybe we're giving up too soon, or maybe we should be a little bit more open-minded and a little bit more generous and gentle in our approaches. But I don't know how common those moments are and how replicable they are, but I think that we have more to learn. How about that?
Sure. A question from Garrick Baker about the writing of the book, which is, how do you go about finding and selecting anecdotes such as the fire jumpers when you're approaching a new book?
Tell me more about the context for the question.
That was it. I guess just probably curious about your process of finding stories and anecdotes to illustrate some of the basic concepts. Like, how do you gather them?
Yeah, so I start with the data that I want to cover, and then the goal is to find a story that will bring the data to life, or show how important the evidence is in a context where the stakes are high, or where the world is particularly interesting. In the case of the firefighters and Think Again, I was first alerted to the Man Gulch disaster by Carl Weick when I took his seminar on the craft of scholarship when I was in grad school at Michigan. And Carl had been heavily influenced by the award-winning book that Norman Maclean wrote, Young Men and Fire, and had done his analysis of it. And then there had been a bunch of subsequent analyses. And so I followed the thread of that. And I thought, even though it was interesting actually for me as a question of originality, because I'm not the first person to tell that story at all. But what I thought was powerful about it was the stakes of not rethinking were extraordinarily high. And also there were multiple missed opportunities to rethink. First there's the, hey, I've got to rethink the way that I survive a wildfire. I actually need to start a fire of my own, not put the wildfire out. And then I can burn a hole in the fire, and that'll protect me because there's no grass to burn around me effectively. Then the second, and you see that rethinking happen with the foreman and not with the crew. Then the second moment of rethinking is, okay, that one's hard, right? It requires extraordinary ingenuity. But the more basic one is not only in Man Gulch, but in other wildfires. Firefighters were slowed down running away from a deadly blaze by not dropping their heavy tools, their shovels, their axes, their packs, sometimes 20 pounds or more. And so, to not pause and rethink, should I be carrying this tool right now, was a missed opportunity. And then I thought I was done. And I was reading more about this, and I read a Catherine Schultz article. And suddenly I realized that this was a great example of a wildfire that didn't need to be fought. No people at risk. Wildfires turn out to be healthy for the life cycles of forests in a lot of ways. This has been at least partially known since the late 1800s, but well established for decades. And so I thought the layers of saying, look, there's an individual rethinking challenge, there's an interpersonal rethinking challenge of getting other people to do the rethinking that you've done, and then an organizational systemic failure to rethink. I thought that was a powerful way to set the stage for what the book was all about. I think the hardest part of my job when I write a book like this is finding the stories that are going to animate effectively, because I have to play journalist. And I never know exactly who's going to have the story or where they're going to be. And sometimes it's reading research articles and looking at the context where the evidence has been gathered. Sometimes it's talking to experts in a couple of different fields and asking them for examples. And sometimes I just, I happen upon an autobiography or a biography or a news article. And I'm like, that is a really cool story. I want to explore that. So I don't know. Do you have advice to add on this? Because I think it's something that a lot of writers struggle with.
Finding those great anecdotes.
Yeah.
I have a note folder on my phone called anecdotes. And anytime somebody tells an interesting story, I scroll like Harriet the Spy. I just quickly write it down. So I steal from everyone I meet, pretty much. And also, Stephen Johnson has that great Spark note that he keeps, right? It's a file where if he comes across something in a book, he just writes it down, and then he'll revisit it periodically and find, make associations between different anecdotes or different thoughts. And I also do something similar like that. I picked that up from Stephen, because it's true. You'll find something, then you'll use it 10 years later. It's remarkable how you'll hold on to something.
Yep.
The tricky thing is if your spouse is also a writer, then you have to fight over who gets the anecdote.
You have to write in different genres is the key.
Yeah, I know. Just turn it into a sci-fi story. Well, we're just out of time. I did have one last question. My curiosity was piqued. How do you pronounce the word mayonnaise?
I pronounce it the way that you do, Panio, which I thought was the correct way. Mayonnaise.
Is there a different? Yeah, mayonnaise. Is there a different way to pronounce it? Because you mentioned in the book that you get a little flack for the way you pronounce it. So what are you doing wrong? Do you have to rethink mayonnaise?
Well, let's be really clear. I say mayonnaise, and the first syllable is man.
Man.
Allison says mayonnaise.
Mayonnaise.
And when she first said it, I was like, wait, she said, can you please pass the mayonnaise? And I was like, do you mean the mayonnaise? And she's like, no, the mayonnaise. And I could not convince her that I was right. And finally she won the argument when she says, what do you call it for short? Oh. And I'm like, please pass the mayo. She's like, aha, it's mayonnaise. It's not man. You don't say, please pass the man. So I've admitted that I'm wrong, but I still can't bring myself to say mayonnaise. It just sounds wrong.
It does.
I know I'm wrong. It just doesn't feel right to say it.
I love that. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. It was really such a pleasure, and great to finally meet you in person too after all these years.
We've been working together for years. I think you've done such creative and such brilliant work in curating the Next Big Idea Club, and I've benefited a lot from your insight over the years. I can't believe we've never met face-to-face before, but delighted that we got to do it, and appreciate you doing all this thinking about the book and giving me a chance to share some ideas and do some new thinking of my own.
It was our pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thanks everyone for coming today.